Hi, I'm Mark Parfitt. I'm a recording and mix engineer. We're at my Midas Collective studio here in North Hollywood. I spend most of my days just cutting records, mixing, being a dad, and it's kind of like just my whole summary of my life pretty much. I got started with just the whole music tech world from just being in bands, playing guitar, monkeying around at my parents' house with, my parents got me like a nice Dell computer, and I was the only kid with a nice like saucy computer. So my friends put a, cracked version of Adobe Audition 3. That was my first introduction to a DAW and totally switched my mind from wanting to be a player and be a musician or be a rock star or whatever it is, and to actually just being on this side of the glass. And I didn't even piece together that you could be a mix engineer or a recording engineer. It's like, I didn't really even think of it as being a job like that. I didn't realize even at that time that it was gonna like become my whole personality for the rest of my life. Moving to Los Angeles and getting locked in with Pooh Bear and Harv were really the main things that, like, the two collaborators that I still work with now 9 years later. I've been able to work with everyone from through them, like Bieber and Party Next Door and SZA, I don't know, the whole load of other people. I can't quite remember them all at this point, but now it's like years later looking at all the hundreds and hundreds of records I've done, and we have a whole facility together now with Harv, and those ones really set me up from the beginning here. Yeah, my philosophy is very just simple and effective, and I'm trying to stay as true to what the song needs, and I'm very much trying not to impart my own personality onto any of the songs. I try to analyze what it is and what it needs versus me having more of a personality. If you ever work with me, we're gonna get to our end destination, and it's gonna be smooth, chill, and no resistance. First thing I pay attention to when I'm opening a mix is what is the identity of the song. That's the first thing I'm trying to target. The humans can only perceive 3 different things at a single time. So if there's 12 things going on in the song, I'm trying to think of what are the 3 main focuses that are the core of the song. Most people are going to be listening to, the vocal, or the drums, and the main music element, or whatever, the song is. Yeah, I have around 1,000 licenses on my iLok at this point, and I think in my template there might be 30 to maybe 40. I think what it takes to make to the template is just being wholeheartedly usable on any song, any session, any artist. It has to just be a very universal tool that I'm always reaching for. But there's only about 30 or 40 of them, and OX Sound for sure is on there because Soothe 2, it lives on every vocal bus immediately, as whether I'm recording or I'm mixing. Everybody's stuff is so high end and so saturated and so processed, where Soothe has been a savior for everyone for a while now, because everything is always just boosted, saturated to the max, and it's so harsh on the high end because digital is just, it gives you everything. There's none of the roll off. It's just all high end. Spiff is definitely different, where I use that much more in a creative instead of a fixing kind of thing. Helping add to the character, helping shape the transient, it does a lot more creatively. I usually typically use it for snares and claps, and it helps add a lot of body, different shape on, the decay, being able to tighten or lengthen it and make it fit the tempo of the song a little bit more as far as how the decay lands. So that's usually how I use it more creatively. For me, Bloom usually lives on guitars a lot. There's something about the mid-range that I really like, that it brings out tonally differently than a traditional EQ. I'm very much more of an additive person. I don't go as much subtractive, so when we can just boost up, slide, and sweep around for the frequency that it's gonna hit, yeah, that's I think guitars and basses is really where it lives for me a lot of the times. Today I'm gonna go through a song called Slow It Down by a group called We The Band. I use a lot of the OX Sounds plugins on this song, particularly because everything's very forward, in your face, pushed, and there's a lot of resonant buildups. There's a lot of harshness on the ear that can come about with using a lot of saturators and smearing the phase with doublers, and I'm using these tools to help with some of these issues that the Vibier plugins bring along.
Someone who understands, you wanna settle You're talking too fast, baby, what you say?
I'm gonna go into vocal world to start off with, because I'm pretty much using Soothe 2 on majority of the vocal buses. The challenge with their vocals is these guys like to use a lot of effects on the voice. It just creates newer issues, and the way they like their processing too, it just makes it a little bit more difficult than traditionally. Because let's see, on Jules' vocal, for example, he's got a doubler across the entire thing, and then he's also got like a really short ambient reverb that's like very high in the mix. Typically, I process all of my EQ, compression, saturation, and then time-based effects on the back end, and then feels a little bit more lively having all of the delays and reverbs being post. But the way they like to do all their stuff is having all the time-based effects before all the compression and reverb, and they just love the way it has everything kind of pressed against the wall. I'll play you Jules' vocal here with and without Soothe, and we'll see what it's doing.
Slow it down, you're moving too fast for me lately, baby. I'm going out of town, I don't know when I'm back, so I won't keep you waiting.
Without?
You say you want a man, someone who understands. You know you wanna settle down. Yeah, baby, you got game, but I don't wanna play. I'm having fun right now, so please, baby, won't you slow down?
I usually use Soothe in kind of two different approaches, as either a full kind of broadband catch-all, massage everything a little bit, or a very hyper-focused attacking certain frequencies. With Jules, there's like some low end weirdness and some high end weirdness. So that's what I'm using Soothe to take care of right here. Attacking around, 350, and then somewhere around like 4 or 5K as well that I'm more focused on, but you can see it's kind of helping everything within that range. I hit the depth pretty hard, and I'll hit the mix at 100%. And then when it's doing too much, then I go and bring both of those back, so it's a little less noticeable. I usually end it always at the end, the last bit of the chain, to kind of clean up any of the digital weirdness that gets built up along the way. This first track is the dry vocal, and then this track that's right underneath is like his effects chain vocal that he usually likes to do. So the main thing that is making up the sound here, it's going to be this Waves doubler 2 and this Butch Vig vocals that's like doing saturation, EQ. It's a pretty aggressive plugin. I'll play this one real quick by itself so you can hear what's going on.
Yeah, I'm from out of town, I'm here for the night, let's not complicate it.
Okay, and then here's with the main vocal blended in.
Down, slow it down, you're talking too fast, baby, what you say? Yeah, I'm from out of town, I'm here for the night, let's not complicate it.
Without the plugin?
You say you wanna settle down and give me all your time. I know I'm not the only one you go and tell the lies.
And with?
But I'll make you come alive, but it's just only for one night. I know you feel that rush now. Please, baby, won't you slow down?
You can see on Harv's vocal, I went more just attack some of that like high mid-range that specifically that Butch Vig saturators bringing in, and it adds this crispiness, but it definitely hurts your ears when you start to turn it up too much. And I'm mostly just focusing in on that. Where on the other vocal, it was a little bit across the whole board because the short ambient verb was adding some low end weirdness, but this one's all like high mids and mids that I'm really trying to just like take care of. Let me slide over to Guitar Land, where we're using a little bit of Bloom. And here's without. And with. The whole reason I was putting this on at the end of the guitar chain is just to help it pop through the rest of the tracks. And you can see with the frequency selector here, I'm just focusing on just this area that's more, in the regular hearing range, and all the lower stuff. I was totally fine with it how it was. still pretty subtle, but it definitely, it pops through and you can feel it kind of come to life a lot more after Bloom is put on. And whenever I use Bloom, I usually leave the mix at 100%, and everything from this compression area, that's the only thing I usually typically adjust is to get my like level of compression. I'll typically start it pretty slammed, and then I'll dial in my attack and release to the, you know, tempo and feel of the song. And then I'll usually bring that back down to like, you know, something a little bit less aggressive. And here's without on the snare. And with. The snare definitely starts to just poke at you and pop a little bit more. And whenever I'm using Spiff, I usually still leave the mix at 100%. I'll crank the depth, and I'll usually focus on sensitivity and decay. I particularly love the decay because it can naturally like lengthen your transient or shorten it, and it still just sounds super smooth. And let's see what it's doing here. I think I kept it on like a medium. Where the cool thing, if you really wanted to like extend it, you can crank it and you can feel like the snare just immediately gets much longer. Or you can shorten it down and make it like extremely tight too. For this song, I was kind of leaning a little bit halfway because I didn't want it to be too tight and I didn't want it to be too long because the tempo is pretty fast and want to leave room for everything else to kind of like breathe. Wow, you can get so much more like body just with the decay. It's like it does a lot. The last place that we got some stuff living at is on the master bus. This is actually for sure by request by We the Band, because they always have Soothe 2 going into God Particle as like their main staple mix bus chain. And I try to, you know, keep the same settings and the same vibe that they had going on, so it keeps the integrity of the song and it'll sound the same that they've been living with, so it's not shaking it up too much. Because everything is just so pushed and slammed and like clipped and they like digitally kind of nasty, but it adds like a funk to it where the Soothe will just help, you know, clear up some of the murkiness.
Slow it down. You're moving too fast for me lately, baby. I'm going out of town. I don't know when I'm back, so I won't keep you waiting. You say you want a man, someone who understands. You know you wanna settle down. Yeah, baby, you got game, but I don't wanna play. I'm having fun right now, so please, baby, won't you slow down?
You can tell it's still doing like it's helping smooth out the track a lot. And it's definitely necessary after it's going through like all these compressors and just gently focusing on it for the master. Well, thanks for coming by. I really appreciate you guys, you know, taking a step into my world. This is gonna be the hardest part. And I did everything else so fine, bro. It's so chill.